Let's turn this on.
Okay.
Ready?
Are we all ready?
Yep. We can hear you.
Okay. Oh, hello, everyone. Welcome to A New Education for a New Economy. We are very grateful to have you all connected today from many different parts of the world. This is truly outstanding. We are in 5 continents, 14 countries, and 30 universities. From America, we have Argentina, Brazil, Haiti, Mexico, the US, Costa Rica. Europe, we have Spain, Italy, Romania, and Germany. From Asia, we have Israel. Africa, we have Mozambique, South Africa, and from Oceania, we have Australia. Very special thanks to the Escolas team, Jose Maria del Corral, Enrique Palmeiro, Daniel Stiliano, for making this possible, together with Rob Johnson, the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. Also, many special thanks for the National Technological University of Argentina for making the connection possible. Asís, we are with the Escolas team and the INET team are now from Assisi. They want to say a few words.
Buenas tardes. Ante los dolores que nos genera el sistema económico predominante, el Papa Francisco nos convoca a pensar, a sentir, a hacer una nueva economía en la que todos tengamos lugar. Y como este giro copernicano de una economía orientada a la maximización de la ganancia a una economía centrada en las necesidades requiere un cambio en la educación, también nos convoca a un pacto educativo global, un pacto donde no solamente las familias y los maestros, sino también los políticos, los deportistas, los artistas, los economistas, se comprometan. También nos hace este llamado. Y es esperanzador esta respuesta donde miles estamos reunidos en los 5 continentes para compartir estas reflexiones, este camino, este hacer. Y quisiera destacar finalmente que aquí en Asís, junto con Rob Johnson, con todo el equipo de INET y de Cátedras Escolas, estamos a pocos metros del lugar en el que San Francisco de Asís, cuando el padre le dijo que se deje de cosas raras y se dedique al negocio familiar, que era muy próspero, por cierto, eran mercaderes de telas y les iba muy bien. Él, para ser libre, se sacó todo, se desnudó literalmente. Y el biógrafo dijo, por primera vez hubo un hombre libre en el mundo. Creo que esta imagen nos puede servir para lo que estamos llevando adelante juntos. Rob.
Thank you, Enrique. Professor Stiglitz, are you able to hear me? We had a very, very exciting and adventurous day today, starting with young people from Morocco, from Mozambique, from Mexico, and from Colombia, describing their experience and the inadequacy of economics education from their eyes, given what they see in the world. We then spent a couple of hours talking about what is missing in economics from the standpoint of advanced scholars, professors, and people involved in education reform. And then we talked about where might the resistances be within the profession. But in that context, a great deal of energy was expressed in relation to the need for collective action, the need to address climate change, and the need for what you might call a broader vision of meaning, where care for others, care about poverty, care about the well-being of many, many people on Earth was at the center of the focus. So we ask you, and we're grateful to you for joining us. We all, as people here know, met the Scholas team with Professor Stiglitz and some of the other people from INET earlier this year. And Joe, we're very interested in your vision of how economics needs to be transformed to be what you might call fit for the mission of guiding the world in its next phase. Thank you for joining us.
Forming the economics curriculum is an absolutely essential one. I think the economics curriculum has to be reformed in virtually every aspect, but I want to talk this afternoon about three themes that I think are central to the reform of the economics curriculum. The first is that we have to live within our planetary boundaries, that man has to live in harmony with nature. And the reality is that we have not been doing that. We have to understand why not and how to reform our economy to ensure that we do that. Here, three old ideas have to be woven together. Economics is about scarce resources, but we have been treating some of our scarcest resources as if they were free goods, our air and our water. And we have been treating some of our scarce resources as if they were not as scarce as they really are. An economy that fails to treat scarce resources as if they are scarce is obviously going to fail. The second idea is the circular economy, that these depletable natural resources have to constantly be reused and not depleted. It is about converting our economy into a circular economy, focusing on recirculating and recycling and renewing. And the third is there are multiple tools for ensuring that we create a circular economy, an economy in which we are in harmony with nature. We have to innovate, we have to invest, there has to be private and public investment, there has to be pricing, and there has to be regulations. And finally, we have to change norms and standards. Many of these ideas are not today part of the standard curriculum, and they have to be brought in. The second idea is that we cannot separate out environmental justice from social justice. This was, of course, one of the main themes of the papal encyclical. The focus on environmental justice got a lot of attention, but if you read it carefully, you'll see that it also emphasizes the inseparability between environmental and social justice. And there are a number of good reasons for this. The first is that the poor are those who inevitably will be hurt most if we don't live within our planetary boundaries. We are already seeing that. We're seeing that the adverse effects of climate change are being felt most strongly in Africa, in some of the poorest parts of India. It's creating climate refugees, climate migrants. Another way of thinking about this is to embed it in the context of intergenerational equity. There are a number of suits going on, for instance, in the United States, and one filed just recently in Canada by children arguing that what the United States and what other countries are doing are shortchanging future generations. The third idea I want to talk about is that to achieve these goals, there has to be collective action, more than we've had, and we have to focus more on how we can work and act collectively better together. The economics of social and economic cooperation moves, in this perspective, front and center. So does a better understanding of why such cooperation has to move up front and center. An understanding, for instance, of externalities. As one economist put it, climate change is the mother of all externalities, of instances in which markets don't work well on their own. But if we think of the central problems and challenges our society faces, none of them are in areas in which the market works well on its own. We have not just an environmental crisis, but we have an inequality crisis. In the US, we face an opioid crisis, a child diabetes crisis. A few years ago, we had a financial crisis. We have a broad moral crisis, with so many of our business leaders taking actions, taking advantage of others, behavior that can only be labeled as moral turpitude. And all of these problems were created by the market and will not be solved by the market on its own. These simple insights, which center the concerns, especially of many of our young people, should center the concerns of our economic courses. We should begin with a clear conception of markets and our economy as a means to an end, not an end in itself. Discuss the challenges we face in meeting our shared ends and the role of collective action in all of its forms, the role of individualistic behavior, of market and non-market institutions in achieving these goals. This stands in contrast to standard courses, where discussions begin with markets. And if there's time, there will be a brief discussion of the limits of markets, of market failures. The pivotal concerns of our students and our society, climate change, inequality, financial crisis, the pivotal policy concerns, access to healthcare and education and housing jobs, these, if they are talked about at all, come at the end of the course. Words like cooperation and coordination, power and powerlessness, social and environmental justice, planetary boundaries are shunned. INET has been supporting creating a new economics curriculum, which has moved a long way in reforming the curriculum of the past. It has provided a foundation on which we can build the next step. And I think INET looks forward in working with COAS in trying to develop a curriculum that will integrate at the center of the curriculum these concerns about environmental and social justice. So my understanding is that there is to be a period now of questions. Is that right?
Yes, if the conference is finished, we can now open questions.
Yes, yeah, that's fine. I could go on, but I think the students wanted a chance to talk, to ask questions, and so I thought, and there were the questions I received were actually quite good questions, so we can use those as a basis of.
Yes, and I want to. It's our most special thanks to you, Mr. Stiglitz, for taking this time and the preparation to do this. It is truly a privilege to have us all connected here and speak about a new approach we should have to economic activity and relations. As St. Francis of Assisi said, start by doing what is necessary, then what is possible, and all of a sudden, you will find yourself doing the impossible. So I think this initiative that will have us all gathered in Assisi in March will be doing exactly that, where Pope Francis calls us young people to rethink our mental and moral priorities to bring them into a greater conformity with God's commandments and the demands of the common good. We can now go to the questions. We can start with the first one that is from Universidad de Buenos Aires, Facultad de Ciencias Económicas. The question will be asked by María de Montserrat Jairo. A ver, habilitamos el micrófono.
Thank you very much for all, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Okay, the questions. Considering that countries have traditionally developed in detriment of the environment, creating gaps between the population and different production sectors, agriculture, industrial, and center-periphery dichotomies. Given that the circular economy puts in crisis the development, production, and consumption models. So, how can the concept of growth and be changed so as to be adopted globally without environmental damage and achieving higher levels of social justice and well-being?
A very good question. Let me begin by focusing on one critical part of your question, which is, can we have sustainable growth? Can we have growth that is consistent with our planetary boundaries? And there is a strand of thought that I hear particularly strongly in Europe, which says the answer is no, we cannot have growth. I find that hard to accept because a very large fraction of the world's population, particularly in Africa and parts of India, are living barely above subsistence. And unless we have some growth, it will be difficult to give large fractions of the world an adequate standard of living. So my view is that we can have growth, but the growth has to be fundamentally different from the kind of growth that we've had in the past. The growth in the past has been based on energy supplied by fossil fuels. We know that we have the capacity to produce energy based on renewable energy. Europe is making a commitment to being no carbon emissions by 2050. And I believe no net emissions by 2050. And I believe that goal is achievable. And if we achieve that goal, that means that at least with respect to climate, we will have been able to achieve sustainable growth. To do that requires changing many of the ways that we function. It means that we will have to have patterns of consumption that are much less energy intensive, obviously much less carbon intensive. It will require a change in how we organize cities, how we organize much of the what we consume, much of the production processes. The good news is that I think that this can actually be the basis of a substantial increase in our standards of living. It will stimulate innovation, partly because it is such a fundamental transformation of our society. And that's why I've been very supportive of what's been called in the United States the Green New Deal. And part of the idea of the Green New Deal is that just like the New Deal in World War II was the basis of a change in many aspects of the organization of our society. It was a moment of inclusion, that we brought women into the labor force. We reduced the scope of a number of forms of discrimination. We didn't get rid of it, but it was the beginning of the underpinnings of our civil rights movement. I think that the response to this environmental challenge, this Green New Deal, could be the basis of not only a world with sustainable growth, but a world with much more social justice as well. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we should be so enthusiastic about these ideas.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stiglitz. We'll now go to the second question from Universidad de Puerto Príncipe, from Haiti. Monica Petit-Homme will ask the question.
Good morning all. My question is, given the economic inequality between South and North countries, and that only 8 major countries have more than 2/3 of the planet's wealth for themselves, and that these countries have been the main beneficiaries from the exploitation of the planet's natural resources. Or do you think that in a world so unequal, the South countries can have the opportunity to flourish economically? And can the circular economy help reduce the South versus North gap? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think that first it emphasizes that as we face the challenges of climate change, the issue of fairness, particularly between the North and the South, becomes paramount. And one of the very disturbing aspects of climate change is that while the emissions are disproportionately historically in the North, the consequences are felt disproportionately in the South. And there's gives rise to a fundamental inequity. At the same time, I think one should be aware that the country that has been receiving, facing the largest property damage is the United States. We have historically been the largest polluter, and certainly the largest polluter per capita. But we, in recent years, have been experiencing losses of almost 2% of GDP. And you may have read about our forest fires, our damage from the hurricanes, from our floods. So what we now realize is that actually everybody in the world is affected. It's also the case that there has been a change in the last 10 years that the South is now the largest emitter of carbon. That China has surpassed the United States as the worst emitter. We are number one in emissions per capita, but China is now emitting more, having more emissions. And that just emphasizes the point that dealing with climate change is going to require efforts by both the North and the South. It's going to require everybody. Now, as we think about how we can have a fair response, it seems to me that the response to climate change cannot deprive the developing countries of their right to develop. That is also paramount. So the question is, how do you square the circle? And the answer is that there has to be significant assistance from the North to the South to enable them both to reduce their emissions and to adapt to the consequences of climate change. There may have been commitments made by the North to the South, but unfortunately, they've not been fulfilled. And I think global civil society is going to have to take an active role in reminding everybody in the North of their moral obligation to help the South. And I think the church can play an important role in that. So I do think it is a moral issue that the North, which contributed so much to the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, has a responsibility to help those in the South adapt, both to reduce their emissions and to adapt to the consequences. There are many ways in which that help forms in which that can take. There needs to be financial assistance, that's obvious, but there also needs to be technical assistance. In the original 1992 Rio Agreement, there was a provision that called for the transfer of technology, that called for the issuance, for instance, of compulsory licenses, so that the technology that facilitate low carbon could be shifted from the north to the south, and so that people in the south could be able to have low carbon growth. And I think that's absolutely essential. Some in the North would like to renege on that 1992 agreement. I think we have to renew that commitment of transfer of technology as an essential part of the way that the North can help the South in addressing the issue of climate. It's not only, of course, about energy, it's about, as you mentioned, the whole circular economy. How do we redesign our whole economy in ways that it ensures that we can live within our planetary boundaries? One of the hopeful aspects of this is that replacing natural resources, innovation that will put less importance on natural resources, will shift the importance of human labor, of human resources. And if it increases the value of human resources, that of course will be of enormous value, benefit to developing countries. So, but of course that means that we have to ensure that we can use our human resources as well as we can, and that means an emphasis on education and lots of other things like that. So there is there's some hope here that moving to the circular economy will actually make more important the resource that is at the heart of, in which so many developing countries are abundant, i.e. Human resources. It will mean for some developing countries a very big change in their economic model, because there are many developing countries who have become very dependent on natural resources, on oil. And they're going to be put in a difficult place. Oil and coal won't be of any value. I mean, we will be moving away from them. And there are many natural, as I say, many countries that are very dependent. One of the countries that is on this conference is Mozambique, and two of the resources that are coal and gas, and we will be moving away from those fossil fuels. And so it becomes even more important for those countries to think about what their development strategy is going to be as we move to the circular economy, to a green economy.
Okay, thank you. We will now go to the third question. University Einstadt School of Pedagogy from Germany.
Hello everyone from Eichstätt. The question to Professor Stiglitz is, what pedagogical methods do you recommend to address ethical economic sharing values to kids in school from the early stages? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that you might say issues of ethics, of philosophy, need to be introduced, as you suggested, very early on. In many ways, fairness is a deeply ingrained concept. Children understand fairness. They're always very sensitive to when they're being treated unfairly. But you go beyond those intuitive notions that children to try to discuss how people have tried to think systematically about what is fair. And I think it's also important to engage in what you might call ethical exercises, to have discussion of some of the dilemmas, some of the trade-offs. There's been a lot of research in behavioral economics on trying to understand how people's perceptions of fairness, what determines those perceptions, how they change over time, what are they affected by, to understand more deeply our sources of empathy, we need also to understand more deeply the consequences of our actions for others. So in some ways, the basic framework of economics has been antithetical towards thinking about ethics. The standard framework in economics courses, the most important theorem is Adam Smith's invisible hand. And that theorem says that the individual's pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. Well, we know that's not true. And a lot of research in recent years has explained why it's not true. But that theorem, that idea, was an idea that championed selfishness. Except if you're selfish, it's okay. Society will still be, societal well-being will be maximized. Well, we have to understand why Adam Smith was wrong, why we have to incorporate ethics into our basic framework of action. There's been a lot of interesting discussion in the United States in the last few months on this issue. The Business Roundtable, which is the group of our leading businessmen, have said that the behavior of firms have to change. The basic legal and basic model of how firms behaved was to maximize shareholder value. They only considered what was in the interest of their shareholders. And that's what gave rise to some of the problems I mentioned in my introductory remarks. The food companies didn't care about the fact that the foods that they were selling to children were leading to an epidemic of childhood diabetes. The drug companies didn't care that they were creating an opioid crisis leading to tens of thousands of people dying. They only focused on the profits. Volkswagen and other firms only thought about their profits as they essentially devised ways of deceiving the regulators who were trying to reduce emissions. The financial sector maximized its profits, engaging in a whole variety of actions that were outrageous, but all without any regard to the moral consequences of what they were doing. So finally, our business leaders have said, we are going in the wrong direction. This is really destroying our society. And they said that corporations have to think about their consequences, not only for their shareholders, but for their customers, for their workers, for the communities in which they operate, for the other stakeholders. Now, how that's done is very difficult, and in economics courses, that should be an important subject of discussion. It's interesting, in Germany, that notion of what is called stakeholder capitalism, or the Rhine model, has long been the dominant model. The model in the United States has been this shareholder capitalism, and focusing only on maximizing the interest of the shareholders. And now we recognize that selfish perspective is not working for our society. You know, this is just one illustration of how these ethical concerns need to be brought into the economics curriculum.
Okay, thank you. Now with dealing with what you just said, we have a set of questions that have to do with values. And now we have the Catholic University of Sao Paulo, Laurent, who will ask the next question.
Yes, hello, Professor. We are discussing, you know, we are in a deep mess in Brazil. Not new, I know. Basically, we teach this economics as a science. I really, let's put it back in the bulk of social sciences and rather think, first of all, this is a set of rules, and the rules we can decide upon them. So we can decide what are the rules which are fair. I'm thinking of this rules for the 21st century have coordinated, and we have to orient it to a fair and sustainable and social economic New Deal. I think we're ready for a global New Deal, just as there had been a New Deal in the US so many years ago.
I agree with you totally. And maybe I should begin by emphasizing how far economics has moved from being a social science. One of the standard models used in much of economics is what's called the Robinson Crusoe model, where you maximize the utility over a lifetime of an individual as if he lived in isolation on an island by himself. And that's the standard model that is used in many American graduate schools, colleges, to think about the resource allocation problem. Of course, Robinson Crusoe is not is a single individual. It's not a social science. The social science has to be about individuals interacting. And the interesting aspect of that particular story is, I don't know if you know, Robinson Crusoe was a famous book written by Daniel Defoe, and about somebody who got shipwrecked on an island. And the interesting aspect of that particular story is that Robinson Crusoe survives only because of his servant, Friday. And what is so interesting about that is the relationship between Robinson Crusoe and Friday was a power relationship. And it was a power relationship not based on any economic rationality, because Friday knew how to survive. Friday was much more ingenious, but the relationship between Robinson Crusoe and Friday was driven by their historical relationships back in England, from whence they came. Well, what I like about that particular story is that it shows that really survival on that island depended on a social relationship, on the relationship between these two individuals, a very small society, but that relationship was not based on, you might call, economic principles, but on power relationships. And that means we have to start thinking very, very strongly about social relationships and what determines them. In my introductory remarks, I emphasize the importance of collective action and cooperation. And if we think about why it is that we have such a much higher standard of living today than 250 years ago, there are two reasons. One has to do with the advances in science that we've learned about nature. We have all these enormous insights. But the second is our understanding of social relationships, our development of social institutions to facilitate cooperation, markets with rules of law, politics with separation of powers and checks and balances. In other words, in a primitive agriculture economy, you don't need complex social organization. But in a 21st century innovation economy, manufacturing, post-manufacturing, service sector economy, coordination and cooperation is absolutely essential. And we live in a world where we're talking now here about the circular economy, a green economy. And we understand that if we're going to survive, we have to act collectively, cooperatively, in ways that will curb our emissions and provide new bases for our economy. And that can only be achieved through collective action. So it seems to me that putting social organization at the forefront of economics is absolutely essential in reforming the economics curriculum, addressing issues of how we cooperate, how we take collective action, how we coordinate, and the kinds of models that, for instance, economists have used in macroeconomics, particularly disturbing, where they have a representative Asian, where everybody's identical, where there's no problems of cooperation or coordination. It really eviscerates this core economic problem. And so that's one of the things that INEC has been working on very actively. It has been to try to address these fundamental issues. So I think you're right on target about how we have to change both the teaching of economics, but also our research in economics, and particularly in areas like macroeconomics.
Amen to that. Yes. And now the next question will be asked by Universidad APEC from Dominican Republic, and Smil Valdez will do the question.
Good evening, Doctor, and good evening to everyone. Our question here is, which initiatives will be necessary to educate professional business people over the challenges that implies a new social economy with a social approach and a sustainable development?
I think I agree with you very much that part of our educational efforts have to be directed at those who are going to be making critical decisions. I would say both in the business community and public service. In terms of business, I think there are two major deficiencies in our education in the past. In the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, where it became evident that the financial sector was engaged in a number of bad practices like predatory lending, discriminatory lending, abusive credit card practices, and afterward we discovered market manipulation, insider trading, lots of things. Many business schools introduced courses on ethics. But I've been very sad that many of those courses were dropped after a few years. After the crisis passed, history, disappeared, and they went back to business as usual. Quite the contrary, I think we need even more to emphasize these ethical issues with our students, especially, as I mentioned before, as we became aware of the opioid crisis, the childhood diabetes crisis, the Dieselgate, Volkswagen problems. So it is very clear, it should be very clear that the business leaders will not have the confidence of the public if they don't reform. And we as educators have a responsibility to make that very clear to them, that they have this much broader responsibility. And that's, of course, helped as we move away from shareholder maximization to a broader perspective that looks on business leaders as being concerned not just with shareholders, but with their workers, with their customers, with the communities in which they operate. And so that seems to me absolutely essential in teaching our future business leaders. There's a second thing that I would want to highlight, and that is business practices that enable our society to be environmentally and socially sustainable. Obviously, if businesses are destroying our environment, they are, our world won't be able to survive. And the same thing is if they're creating huge divides, the economy won't survive. If a business has to be able to sell to customers, but customers, if they're going to buy, have to have an income. And if the business community doesn't pay adequate wages, workers aren't going to be able to buy, and the system is not going to be sustainable. It's not going to be sustainable economically, and it's not going to be able to be sustainable politically. So I think we have to work with our future business leaders, our students, to make them understand that you might say there are limits of selfishness, and that it is in their own self-interest that the businesses operate together in a way that is economically, socially, politically sustainable. And they haven't been doing that. I would work very hard on our students to make sure they feel guilty if they go into the energy sector and they build a coal-fired plant. Maybe guilt is not the best thing, but I would work hard to make them feel, to realize that if they went into the food industry and they sell these foods that lead to childhood diabetes, that's really terrible. And you should feel bad. You should take it as a your individual guilt for having behaved in that way. That we all have to be individually accountable for our actions. We can't just say, I'm just one person in a big economic machine. If we work for a corporation that is exploiting others, we should change that. And exploitation is not a way to make profits. And, I'm getting a little astray here, but we have a president in the United States who throughout his whole life has been exploiting other people. And it has brought us to the impasse that we have in the United States today. We cannot have a society in which some do well through the exploitation of others. And unfortunately, to a too large extent, that's the nature of towards which 21st century capitalism has been moving, and we have to change that. It's not necessary. In fact, it's destructive. I would also try to explain that one can do well by doing good. That the companies that are going to be ahead of the game in developing renewable energy that are going to be environmentally green are going to make higher profits, because in the long run, we will all eventually have to recognize the necessity of a green economy. And so the companies that are dragging their feet and not making the green transition, they're going to be in the long run they're going to be in a disadvantaged position. So there is even an element of self-interest in companies being able to be on the right side of history. And so eventually the companies that have done the right thing, I think in the long run, tend to do better. And that would be an important part of the curriculum that I would want to talk about.
Thank you, Mr. Stiglitz. We'll now go to another question from the Universidad Católica de Valencia. Francisco Lara will ask the question.
Thank you very much, everybody. Especially I want to thank you in particular, the Professor Stiglitz, but also the Escolas Ocurrentes for the invitation for being part of this interview. So my question is very concrete and also is related with the issues that the Professor Stiglitz already mentioned in the previous thing. I'm a professor in Spain, but also I'm a professor in Washington, D.C. at the Catholic University of America. So the first question is, which are the main changes that we should make in the course of teaching economics? You mentioned this idea of business ethics, how we can introduce business ethics into our teaching in the business school everywhere in Spain, but also in the US. And the second question is, what are the ethical and anthropological basis for this new economic thinking? Because one of the challenges, and I would like to be a devil advocate here of the circular economy, is that they can also forget about the anthropological basis, focusing only on nature and forgetting about the individual, the person, and the anthropological basis. Thank you very much, Professor.
Well, I tried to describe before some of the changes that you have to make in the economics curriculum. Let me point out that many of the ideas that I put forward have been part of an agenda of reforming economics over the last 40 years, but unfortunately have not gotten integrated into the standard curriculum. And there's a kind of perversity in this. And I think it does represent, to some extent, an ideological aspect to the teaching of economics. So let me just give you a couple examples. A lot of the standard teaching in economics begins with, as I mentioned, markets work well, the efficiency of markets. But we know from my own research that whenever information is imperfect, which is always, or asymmetric, which is always, or risk markets are incomplete, which is always, then markets are not efficient. You know, as I sometimes put it, the reason Adam Smith's invisible hand, which says that markets are led as if invisible by hand with the pursuit of self-interest to the societal well-being, the reason the invisible hand is invisible is that it's not there, and that markets are not, in general, efficient. But that idea is usually put way at the end of the course rather than up front. Similarly, we talked today about firm value maximization versus the idea that firms ought to look at their workers, their customers, and the communities in which they operate, a much broader perspective. The impact on the environment. Well, again, economic theory, my own work 30 years ago showed that value maximization did not lead to societal well-being, but it wasn't incorporated into the standard economic courses. We know that the macroeconomics has exhibited an enormous amount of instability, as evidenced by the 2008 crisis, but there have actually been more than 100 crises around the world since 1980, after we began the process of deregulation. And yet the standard macroeconomics courses begin with the hypothesis that mystically, the economy is always in equilibrium. They assume that the problem are shocks that come from the outside rather than bubbles that are created endogenously within the economic model itself. Standard economics models that we teach in our courses assume that individuals are infinitely rational. We know that's not true, and there's a huge amount of work over the last 30 years about behavioral economics. You might call it the anthropological basis, or how do people actually behave rather than a mystical person. And we recognized that an important part of that is endogenous preferences. Standard economic models begin with the assumption that people come into the world with well-defined preferences. But we know, as parents, we work very hard to shape our children, to teach them to be ethical, to teach them to work hard. And as teachers, we have, I think, a moral obligation to try to shape our students. One of the very disturbing aspects of the economics profession is that there is evidence that the longer students study standard economics, the more they become like the assumptions of our model. They become more selfish. So we lead them into being more selfish. I don't think that's a good thing. So we ought to be aware of the influence of our courses on shaping individuals and in shaping our students. So it seems to me it's an important behavioral economics has brought all these insights. So in that sense, I would say the economics profession is at a good point here. We've made a lot of advances, but a critical failure is that we have not yet incorporated many of these advances into our curriculum. And if we could do that, the next generation of economists would be even more attuned to the problems of our society. So just let me put this in a slightly different way. I recently had some, discussions in a number of different countries with what were the students most concerned with? What are the issues that the students are most concerned with? They're concerned about climate change. They're concerned about inequality. They're concerned with the ways in which the economy isn't serving our society. And they're concerned about the nature of innovation and the way innovation seems to be focused on saving labor, which seems to be in surplus, rather than saving our planet. Well, as I think about that, you look at our education curriculum, take the basic graduate economics course or basic undergraduate course, how much do we spend talking about inequality? How much time do we spend talking about climate change? How much time do we spend about talking about these other concerns that are at the core of what young people really care about? The answer is almost none. And so it seems to me that we should take a little guidance from the issues that are paramount in the minds of our students that really do reflect the problems of our society, and take our cue from that and say, how do we reform our economics teaching to reflect those concerns and to say, how can we give some guidance to how our society can address these problems, try to create a better economy, a better society going forward.
Well, thank you very much. We're very glad that you have this vision, and I feel obliged to ask the next question, because for all who don't know this, here in Argentina, we have a new Minister of Economy who has been a student of Mr. Stiglitz, Martín Guzmán. And this is the final question, but we would like you to speak about a little bit about Martín. What do you think of him? What expectations you have of him, since he has been your disciple? And of course, we're very excited here in Argentina that we have this opportunity to have someone who is in charge of the economy of the country that has this type of thinking that you are explaining today.
Well, I'm very excited about both for Martin and for Argentina that Martin has gotten this appointment. Martin was always very unusual. He came to Columbia as a postdoc, and is really one of the, in 50 some years of teaching, he's one of the best I've ever had. So he's really superb. I mean, really, it's really, I've had some fantastic students, but he's among the very top I've had in 50 some years. But he was different from many of my other students because he decided he wanted to chart a different course. He wanted to do theory and standard economics, you might say, like others, but he also wanted to make a difference. He really wanted to be socially involved. He wanted, so many of our students who come to the United States want to make their life in the United States. He knew that he wanted to go back to Argentina, and he knew that he wanted to make a contribution to Argentina. And he's now finally gotten an opportunity to really make a contribution. But it was not just Argentina, it was much broader. One of the issues that we worked on very closely together for many, many years has been the problem of debt. And we worked on that in many different contexts. At a theoretical level, we worked on it together in the context of Puerto Rico that has a major debt problem. And he worked very, very strongly to get a resolution of Puerto Rico's debt problem that would be good for Puerto Rico and not for the bondholders and the vulture funds. You might say it was training for the problem he's going to have to face today. He worked with the United Nations to try to work with creating a set of principles for a sovereign debt restructuring framework. So he pursued in a really remarkable way two tracks, a very academic theoretical track, but another track that was really committed to addressing the well-being of many, individuals in Argentina, in Puerto Rico, in other places, and he obviously, Argentina has inherited a very difficult situation from the previous president. The previous president, his economic team, prided itself and said, we have some problems, but at least we haven't inherited a very low debt. And now Fernandez has inherited all the earlier problems plus a debt problem. So it highlights the challenge. But if anybody is up to dealing with it and giving good advice, Martin is.
We're in God's hands right now. Now, I believe if Rob and Enrique want to say a few words from Assisi.
Well, first of all, I would say that we experienced, those of us from INET, Scholas, Professor Stiglitz, and myself, we experienced a miracle, because when we had our meeting, the person who was employed as translator was Martin Guzman, who is your new minister. And Martin Guzman helped us bring ourselves all together and helped us. And I think—
Can you speak closer to the microphone? We can't hear you.
Let's see. So I said we had a very miraculous experience, which is when we first met with Pope Francis, Scholas, Joseph Stiglitz, and myself, the person who was the translator was Martin Guzman. And he brought us all together, and now we send him off with good wishes and good luck. But perhaps it was a miraculous experience that he has now become the economy minister. And as Joe said, he did fantastic work. He worked very closely with our organization, INET's Young Scholars Initiative, which I invite all of you online to explore, because I think there is a network there that shares your concerns and shares insights and ways to explore your curiosities and to address these problems and diminish your frustration. We had a very powerful day today here, talking about economics with young people in the beginning. We're very passionate about what is missing in economics. And then the professionals spent the afternoon discussing what we felt was missing and how difficult it was to inspire change. Robert Skidelsky, the great scholar and biographer of Keynes, said to us, can new economic thinking come from within the profession, or do we have to go beyond? David Collender, who has been at the core of curriculum reform around the world, said to us, Albert Hirschman wrote of passions and interests, can we mix where the passions are present? And my answer was, if we don't address the issues that matter, the passions will become unwieldy and the violence and protest and despondency will tear apart society. So we are in the middle of 2 days of very, very intense discussion, but dedicated to exploring with you all now and in the future ways in which to reform the economic curriculum and work under the guidance of people like Professor Stiglitz to repair something that seems quite clearly out of balance right now. And Joe, your comments that for 40 years, with your leadership and others, the research has a much more textured and nuanced sense than has translated into the textbooks, is perhaps the most formidable challenge that INET faces today, is to introduce and propagate these more subtle and more textured understandings into the way in which people who are professional economists and people who are business leaders, public servants, teachers, and in every walk of life understand the economy as a means to the end, as in service of social goals rather than as dominating and setting those social goals. So thank you all for participating today. Thank you, Enrique and Daniel, for bringing INET into the conversation with you.
Quería recordar que cuando estuvimos con el Papa Francisco, lo primero que él le dijo cuando lo vio a Joseph Stiglitz fue: qué bueno es ver a un economista sonreír. Y es, a través de esa simple observación, me parece que está el reconocimiento de que en esta etapa de la humanidad vuelva a predominar una orientación económica centrada en la felicidad humana.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Thank you, Enrique. And Mr. Stiglitz, if you didn't understand, Enrique reminded what Pope Francis said to you, that when he met you, he was very happy to finally see an economist smile.
Thank you. Thank you.
There we have it. There we have it.
Thank you.
And now, well, we're really thankful for the time you took to answer all the questions, and very happy for this. And we now want to show a video, a compilation of small videos that all the universities have sent to us. Please stay tuned for that, and then we will close the connection. I don't know, Joe, if you want to say some final words, or we can just go straight to the video. Mr. Stiglitz. ¿Qué pasa? Póngame el video. Video.
Va bien.
Me preocupa la falta de trabajo que hay en el país y la situación de pobreza.
La que genera futuro a los niños, niñas.
Afecta a la igualdad de oportunidades.
Me preocupa que no se fomente el trabajo y la producción nacional.
También nos preocuparía que el Estado no invierta lo suficiente en infraestructura, como especialmente las viviendas, que es un problema muy importante luego.
En especial las posibilidades de desarrollo productivo y tecnológico.
Avances a una velocidad mucho mayor que la resolución de los problemas éticos y sociales que producen. El objetivo de esta nueva universidad tiene que ser justamente eso, acompañar a la sociedad en estos cambios tecnológicos con humanismo.
Las 10 plagas que veíamos son la desnutrición infantil, la exclusión de los jóvenes, el narcotráfico, la destrucción del ambiente, la guerra civil y la violencia que mata en las calles, los inmigrantes y los sin techos, la angustia, la soledad y la depresión que llevan a muchos jóvenes al suicidio, la plutocracia de las instituciones que generan una crisis de representatividad y el descarte de las dos puntas más débiles de la vida, los ancianos y los niños, y la violencia contra las mujeres. De esas 10 preocupaciones nos pareció que la fundamental, la grieta que más está haciendo doler a nuestra casa común en Córdoba es el desempleo de los jóvenes.
Uno de los aspectos que más preocupa a la educación a nivel global es la marginalidad, la pobreza, la indigencia y la falta de inclusión en los medios escolares. Tenemos un grave problema que es cómo y de qué manera se solucionan. La pobreza, la indigencia y la marginalidad lleva como consecuencia a la incapacidad de poder ingresar en un régimen escolarizado que posibilite la movilidad social, el ascenso social y desarrollar las capacidades para los medios laborales.
Nos duele una sociedad desigual, una sociedad con falta de oportunidades, una sociedad donde la gente no tiene posibilidades de acceder a aquellos caminos que tiene razones para valorar.
Lo que entendemos y vemos es que han surgido varios conflictos sociales en nuestra región, lo que nos invita a repensar esta situación y sus múltiples aristas.
Bueno, vemos que desde el quiebre del modelo chileno, la crisis institucional de Bolivia, de Perú, Ecuador, Venezuela, Nicaragua y la propia nuestro país hacen reaparecer distintos personajes o personalidades que apuntan hacia una puja por la imposición de modelos neoliberales en la región. Tal es el caso de Jair Bolsonaro, de nuestro propio país, Mauricio Macri, el reciente presidente electo de Uruguay, Iván Duque, que en realidad muestran un desafío por resignificar el concepto mismo de economía que se ha volcado en estos últimos años, una primacía por el aspecto más tecnicista, más desarrollo de políticas destinados justamente a ese perfil, pero que en realidad tienen cierta o nula efectividad en el campo social.
Como consecuencia de este quiebre en la capacidad adquisitiva percibimos una alteración en los entramados sociales, en las relaciones entre las personas, que repercute de manera directa en la organización social, no solo en el presente más próximo, sino también en las expectativas a futuro con impacto en las generaciones venideras, en el futuro de las familias.
El principal problema económico que enfrenta la sociedad dominicana es la mala repartición de los recursos económicos del Estado. Esto afecta a la masa pobre de la República Dominicana, privándola de oportunidades de crecimiento. Creo que una mejor inversión de los recursos del Estado en creación de programas inclusivos y técnicos a esta parte de la sociedad podría abrir la oportunidad de nuevos empleos, generando ingresos para así una preparación universitaria a futuro.
La República Dominicana obtuvo hace unos 6 años la aplicación de un aumento al presupuesto del sistema educativo. Durante 14 años se peleó porque se introdujera el 4% del Producto Interno Bruto o el 16% del presupuesto para sustentar las actividades en expansión del sistema educativo. pero el 4% no ha significado un cambio directo en la calidad de los resultados que se ofrecen en la República Dominicana. Por lo tanto, el sistema tendrá que revisarse a sí mismo. Este 4% ya no alcanza, y darle a la conducta de entrada del sistema educativo en la sociedad dominicana una reformulación general a partir de las propuestas de transformación curricular en la formación de los profesores, que son la correa de transmisión, de alguna manera, de la calidad de un sistema. El tema de la educación superior es otra cosa. Nunca ha peleado un espacio en las estrategias de desarrollo, como sí ocurre en las estrategias, por ejemplo, de los países OCDE, en los cuales no hay ninguna propuesta de carácter desarrollista a corto o mediano plazo que no implique al mismo tiempo una transformación del sistema educativo de educación superior en el que se sustenta. La educación superior en nuestro país, obviamente, que requiere también una revalorización del papel de la educación superior, tanto en el aparato productivo como en la calidad de la vida de todos los dominicanos.
No nos sentimos movilizados solo a un cambio urgente en las políticas económicas y en la educación universitaria, sin excluir que esto sea también necesario. Nos mueve sobre todo la urgencia de una transformación de la economía en su conjunto, es decir, en el modo como está estructurada y cómo funciona la dinámica económica, y de manera muy particular un cambio en los presupuestos teóricos que dan fundamento a ese funcionamiento de la economía. Solo si apuntamos a ese doble cambio, podríamos decir que apuntamos también a cambiar hacia otra economía, como lo pide el Papa Francisco.
Es obvio que los dos problemas fundamentales en Costa Rica, de los que se derivan otros muchos, son, primeramente, la creciente desigualdad de ingresos, de acceso a servicios básicos de calidad y de oportunidades. De esto depende la posibilidad de desarrollar las capacidades fundamentales. Esto choca con la apropiación del mayor porcentaje de los beneficios del crecimiento por parte de una minoría de la población. En segundo lugar, la endémica pobreza, en torno a un quinto de los hogares costarricenses, y que da lugar a situaciones de inhumanidad en diversos grados.
Lo que nos mueve y preocupa es la demostrada incapacidad de la economía dominante para enfrentar la desigualdad y la pobreza existentes, y la ceguera para reconocerlo y emprender seriamente un cambio en profundidad. Para lograrlo, proponemos un esfuerzo conjunto que empiece por transformar la disciplina económica en una ciencia de síntesis que considere todas las dimensiones de la persona humana y su relación con el ecosistema desde una perspectiva ética y espiritual, de manera que conduzca a un desarrollo humano armonizado.
Estamos aqui no Brasil e no Encontro Nacional da Economia de Francisco, e você vai conhecer um pouco da gente aqui a partir dos nossos clamores e ideias e propostas para o espaço de uma nova economia ou de novas economias.
Eu sou a Daiane e entendo que a maior dor enquanto mulher negra é ser ouvida, ser vista, porque se tem uma coisa que a economia no mundo não pensa, é na ação das mulheres negras e que decorre a partir da vida delas. Eu acredito que esse é o momento da gente poder olhar, ouvir e construir um mundo novo a partir da economia.
Eu acho que a nova economia, ela é importante que ela seja quente e não seja fria, que ela pense nas pessoas, que esteja relacionada com o nosso dia a dia e não com questões passadas já que não se aplicam hoje ao nosso dia a dia.
De um grupo, né, detém 50% dos bens de toda a humanidade. Então nós devemos discutir essa economia. Que economia é essa? Que economia é essa que mata? Que economia é essa que não é justa, que não é solidária? Então nós devemos pautar isso e discutir essa economia mais humana, essa outra economia.
Pensar em uma nova economia não é apenas pensar nas relações dos humanos com os humanos, mas também pensar numa relação do meio ambiente e como nós tratamos como humanos desse meio ambiente, porque ele não pode servir apenas como uma matéria-prima para gerar um produto, mas sim como uma casa dos comuns. Então a gente tem que valorizar não apenas nossas relações enquanto humanos com humanos, mas no meio ambiente como nossa casa.
We cannot teach economics just how to reach short-term results. This is about outcomes, and the outcomes are social, economic, political, and cultural. This means we have to take these issues more broadly and teach them more broadly. We're destroying this planet for the few, and we have huge amounts of money in tax havens and speculative activities, and this can be reoriented, all these resources, financial and technological resources, to respond precisely to the sustainability issue and to the inequality issue, which are obviously our key challenges. The next issue is that we have to teach economics for really existing people, not this kind of rational profit maximizer that we have relied in our analysis. Another point is that we have to go, obviously, beyond competition. We are entering the knowledge economy, and in the knowledge economy, collaborative actions, collaboration in general, is much more productive than the war of everyone against everyone. We have to study and teach the enormous experiences that we already have in this field. The top priority, obviously, is that we have to end the suffering of billions who are deprived, who are in poverty, who are dislocated, who are humiliated. We have the money, we know where the problems are, we have the technologies. Really, first things first. For me, this is how we would reorient our economy.
It happens that schools are offered tablets for their classes for no money under the condition that all the data goes to offering company. It also happens that politicians think it is smart to invest in buying smartphones for children in schools, even though medical researchers have proven that the bad effects on mental health and talk about this in the media. What can we do, or you, globally against this, and instead nourishing ethical leadership of schools and ministries so that they invest in healthy education? Especially in our country, Germany, with such a bad history in excluding the weak, we feel very ashamed for this. We are planning to start a petition referring to this topic in Germany.
Actually, it is facing to a bad situation, a political crisis where the population are asking to our president to go away because he can't assume his function. So the population is stressed out every day to have a better life. This political crisis has a lot of bad consequences on our economy, on our life, like Asian. So our bank can't function as usually, our economy goes down, our students can't go at school, so we just want to have a better life like Asian. We want to have if we want to have good education, I want to participate in this campaign, and we want to improve the situation for having a better life in the future. So we are concerned like human, like women in this situation, and we want to work for having a better life in the future.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for your time. We hope you enjoy this and see you maybe in another connection meeting. Goodbye.